Hello, everyone. Kind of struck me, I guess, maybe this is a little backwards. I think the talk that my main goal today is to look at targets for wildlife. So rather than do a project and then see if it's good for wildlife, I'd like to say look at the experience that I've had and make recommendations for restoration or wetland creation in reservoirs, and try and solve some of the problems or improve things at least. All the work I have been doing is for hydro or the compensation program. I work for Cooper Beauchesne Associates and I partnered with the Okanagan Nation Alliance. Main thing I'd like to, I'm just quick overviews. I'm first going to talk about reservoir operations and drawdown zones. I think we know a lot about them, but I just want to review. I thought it'd be good to give a little quick slideshow of wetlands I've known in reservoirs. The main focus is birds today, and so nesting is one component of the way birds use reservoir drawdown zones. So I think this is my main goal, is to really drive this one home today, some of the issues. And the wetlands that are in drawdown zones create good habitat for migrant water birds. And then sort of wrapping it all up in my very non-engineering way. I do not have a ton of experience with this wetland restoration, but from a bird perspective, what I think would be a good sort of target. So this is my main introduction right here, one slide. Reservoirs globally, and I think it sets the stage. 16.7 million reservoirs estimated in the world. 55,000 of them greater than 15 meters high, dams. And together, the volume of stored water by reservoirs, 10,800 cubic kilometers. I think that's supposed to affect the spin of the Earth a little bit. I haven't read that paper in detail, but it's a huge, huge impact globally. And what goes along with all of those is reservoir drawdown zones in many of those projects. So here in Burton, I know we have our local. We've seen that the landscape change in 69, 68, 69, and over time since the Hugh Keenly side was created. And I think that's the best thing to focus on is locally. But I'd love to see this something that happens all over the world. People start taking notice of reservoir drawdown zones and what everyone's created or thought of it as an individual project, and I think there's committees for different reservoirs, but people don't look at the big picture much. So I think it's awesome to have grassroots focus, but I also think it'd be good to really see more in the conservation biology literature on this subject, and there's not much. So just quickly to go over reservoirs in general, we've got some run-of-the-river operations, which this is the Revelstoke Dam just above where I live, and it has a fluctuation of about 1 meter. It's just basically a big lake, and it's got some issues, I'm sure. I'm not very well versed in them, and that's not really what I'm talking about today, but I think there's quite a few examples of those around. Storage reservoirs, water storage. That's really, I think, what we mostly think of when we think of reservoirs, and these are the ones with these moonscapes, commonly referred to as moonscape reservoir drawdown zones, and it's the rise and the fall of the water that denudes the habitat. They can vary quite a bit. This is in the States. You can see the water elevation going up and down every year with this little cycle, but also the whole reservoir goes up and down. And I believe that the wetness of the climate probably has something to do with that. It creates, this is, I'm sure the full pool line is somewhere up here, and this probably hasn't been inundated for a while, and it's growing up, and this is more recently inundated. And we have piping plovers nesting in there, endangered species, and it's an ecological trap. These birds their nests are killed by the water every year. And here we have the Arrow Lakes. Also a lot of annual fluctuation, but year to year it's a lot more consistent. We've definitely got some low fluctuation years and some high fluctuation years, but is primarily characterized as an annual cycle and not so much an among-year cycle. So you get a little less of the dynamic of vegetation being destroyed and created as you would have in the last example. In many of the U.S. Reservoirs, vegetation grows up over time when the reservoir's in the dry years, and then the water comes up and then kills it, and that's sort of their big issue. Here we get a lot more of in the arrow, we get a lot more of a steady cycle, and what you end up with is these really clearly defined horizons, as I'm sure you all know, with low down at 433 and below being basically silt and sand. Then at 433 you get the reed canary grass and the sedges, up to about 436, and then you get the willow coming in, and then above 438 you can get quite a bit more. And so it's a fairly stable set of vegetation communities. And so that's the thing about reservoir operations. So in the drawdown zones, there are wetlands that exist, and I just thought it'd be interesting for today's crowd to just look at some of those, because as a biologist you get to move around the province quite a bit and see these things, and not everyone else gets to look at those. So this is in Kinbasket, this picture here, in the drawdown zone. This is in the Williston Reservoir. So actually I'll just back up. This is incredibly good nesting habitat for birds, and it's near the full pool mark. This is in the Williston Reservoir near the airport, and it's very, I think it's a lot of those black spruce bog upslope from this. And we've got a lot of moss growing in the drawdown zone. There's really good shorebird foraging habitat, and not very good nesting habitat at all, but there will be some. One of the more interesting things here is yellowlegs nesting above the drawdown zone, foraging in the drawdown zone. So that's kind of a nice situation. That's a bit of a wetland in a reservoir, and there's another view of it. It's an osprey nest. This is in Bush Arm, in the drawdown zone, one of the nicest wetlands I've seen there. You concur, Virgil? You know where this is. Skunk cabbage, we've had ducks nesting there, snipe, various things. And this is a different wetland also in Bush Arm area. Now this is Cartier Bay, which we've seen some photos of today at Revelstoke Reach. This is more one that I study quite a bit, and a bunch of us have studied. It's just over 433 meters above sea level. 433 meters above sea level. So about, 7 meters below the full pool, 6.5. So it gets inundated, it turns into pure lake. Virgil had good photos of that earlier today, of it transforming. This is just south of Revelstoke, yeah. So Cartier Bay, I'll be talking about this a bunch today. Notice there's reed canary grass and sedge, no real emergence, but lots of submergent vegetation, milfoil and things like that. This is also around Revelstoke, the Downey Marsh. It's being a little bit inundated by the reservoir in this photo. All of this is in the drawdown zone. Some of these trees are right at full pool, but most of that vegetation's in the drawdown zone. Now, this is the coolest one of all, really. Montana Slough, it's commonly called. I often call it Montana Bay. 4 meters below full pool, and we've got cotton grass, sundew, and Labrador tea and pine growing here. And the reason is because it floats, goes up and down 4 meters with the reservoir as the reservoir comes in. So this is a great example of a floating, I don't know if it's a bog or a fen or it's got lots of sphagnum. It's mostly sphagnum. It's got lots of water coming and going. Yeah. I'd love to send some sort of a submarine under it, see what it looks like when it's floating. Sorry, no, Arrow Lakes. Yeah. It's just past the airport going south on the airport way. There's mailboxes on the right. People often know that. There's a nice little pond there. And basically, yeah, it's a pretty neat site. Pardon me? Yeah, and it's just past. In your opening slide, you had a picture of it. Yeah, and so this is the granddaddy wetland that I know of, the airport marsh at Revelstoke, 2 meters below full pool, or just a little less. So it gets inundated by 1.5 meters of water, and it's an amazing wetland. It'd be great to do a bioblitz there. Very important for turtle and many species of birds. So these are all types of wetlands that are already occurring in reservoirs. So they could make targets for any restoration project. And that's why I think it was important to just show some of these today. And here's another view of that, the bulrush in this case, rather than cattail. And another view, lilies. It's a really cool wetland. Oh yeah, so here's another one, Watchan. This is kind of an interesting one. If you come in April, you'll see these cattails growing on top of a sand dune. And you go in mid-June and it looks more like this, or July. I've been working up there for quite a while. Wonderful reservoir as far as reservoirs go. The main points I think I really wanted to make here is that wetlands have quite a bit of resiliency. Even Cartier Bay, which is as much as almost 7 meters below the full pool, has a lot of vegetation growing in it, and provides a lot of ecological value for birds, which I'll get to more in a bit. But they're moist year-round, so they don't go through the cycle of being completely arid and then completely swamped under, well, they do get swamped, but they don't alternate. They're always wet. And also the vegetation that grows in them is accustomed to being wet, so it's not like terrestrial vegetation that suddenly has to become aquatic. And in these reservoir drawdown zones, they occur as sometimes a unique little basin feature, or quite commonly, especially in Kinbasket, some of the wetlands are runoff from upslope. So lower down in the drawdown zones, you don't get the emergent vegetation that we see in some of the higher elevation sites. So now I want to, probably my main topic today is nesting in the drawdown zones. This is probably 437.5, 438 meters on the Arrow Lakes Reservoir. So that's 2 meters below full pool, 2.5, and lots of willow growing here, reed canary grass, and this is a really well-used habitat for nesting birds in the shrubs and in the grass and at the base of the shrubs. Where you find nesting birds in the reservoir drawdown zones is where there's good nesting cover. So what we found, and I think this would be pretty typical in the really barren landscapes, you get very few nesting birds. When you get to reed canary grass, a little higher, there's also not very many. What did you call it earlier? Biological desert. So the reed canary grass is like a biological desert. It does get use. I'll mention some of that now. When you get multiple dry years, we get grassland species building up in there. It's not pure reed canary grass, and things like savanna sparrows will pick maybe some of the more native grass spots that are left. Short-eared owls nest there, and that's because the vole populations build up. And then the short-eared owls nest in. Meadowlarks, and there's a variety of other grassland species that could potentially nest there that generally don't. The grass is usually inundated before nesting season gets too far underway, and there's no success. Then you get into the shrub zone, and you get cedar waxwings nesting, and so forth. The more complex the habitat is with vegetation, the riparian habitats and the shrub savannas and then into the wetlands, the more nesting birds you get. So what you end up with is higher in the reservoir drawdown zone, you get more complex habitat, more complex vegetation communities, and a lot more nesting birds. So here, I just run through some of the species we found in the Arrow Lakes Reservoir. American Avocet, on the ground, we've American Avocet here, killdeer, there's 4 eggs. Killdeer are one of the more common birds nesting in the drawdown zones, as are spotted sandpiper. These guys are usually in just gravel or unvegetated sites. And these guys are in sort of sparse grasslands, tufts of grass. And in the real boggier sort of sites, we get snipe nesting quite commonly in both reservoirs, both Kinbasket and the Arrow Lakes. We've also found, this year, Tennessee Warbler was a new one on the ground. So that's in a more forested site. In the grasslands, meadowlark, Savannah sparrows. This is actually at Virgil's log boom. I think this is probably the cat track right here. And a little stump, and under here was a Savannah sparrow. This is that started nesting after you left. Right after you left. So you created a good nest site. Yeah. And there were killdeer, I noticed, foraging in your pond there too. Mallard. There's lots of ducks nesting on the ground. We've had quite a few species now. And we have raptors. We've had short-eared owl, long-eared owl, northern harrier. And in the shrubs, so a bunch of those are actually, the ground nesters can go quite low in the drawdown zone, and you get in the grass and you get them there. But the shrub nesters really are at the upper level, so 436 up, more like 438 meters, so a couple meters below full pool. And in the shrubs, that's when diversity really happens, and we get, there's a ton of them. I think I'll get to how many we've got so far. Cedar waxwing, willow flycatcher, yellow warbler, chipping sparrow. And at the highest elevation drawdown zone, you can have trees growing. And in Revelstoke, we have a really nice example at Machete Island. They've basically been growing in the drawdown zone since the reservoir started. It was a pole yard when they created Arrow Lakes Reservoir, and now it's our best cottonwood stand. And western wood pewee, woodpeckers, wood duck. So that's in the trees, and then we have the wetlands in the drawdown zone, and there you get a whole different set of birds. And just run through some examples of the sora, yellow-headed blackbirds. Pardon me? Oh yeah, we've got lots of soras. They love they're in Watchan too. These guys? What's that? Yeah, that's a bird. Yeah, that's, like a 6-day-old one, and this is like a 13, 14-day-old. That's what they do.
How do you walk through a wetland? Because it must be a lot different than how most people.
Well, yeah, we're in waders, usually. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're carefully. We pick our way through them. The bulrushes are, in these patches, and they're actually, you can see the nest quite easily once you're looking for them, and so we're carefully. I think it was more the ones that are right on the ground that are really nerve-wracking. It's like, someone's found a nest and you're going to check it. That's when I get nervous. It's like, okay, I can't find it. Where was this thing? So. And trampling vegetation and that kind of stuff's an issue we have to worry about. So Virginia rail, pied-billed grebe, very cool bird. These are all in the wetlands. So I kind of introduced this study a little later on in my talk, but I should introduce it now. This is all part of one study to do with nest flooding in the drawdown zone, which is the topic I'll get to in a moment. During the course of the study, this BC Hydro study, water license requirement study, this is a running tally of the number of species we found nesting in the two drawdown zones. So we're up at, over 60 species in Arrow Lakes, nesting below the full pool mark. And in Kinbasket, we're holding steady around 30. We don't find anything new there anymore. Watchan, I've worked in Watchan quite a bit, and I can think of about 7 species that are in the drawdown zone, but there's been no real study of the birds. Watchan's just down here, 20 kilometers, Needles, across the ferry or Folkier across the Needles ferry, and then right up there, on the other, just over the hill on the Monachies. Yeah. Yeah, right over, directly across, yeah. It's a really cool reservoir, actually. So, from that last slide, you can see there's quite a difference between these two reservoirs, and there really is. I mean, that's not a sampling effect. That's the way it is. The Arrow Lakes Reservoir has a ton of really good nesting habitat, especially in the Revelstoke Reach area, right around Revelstoke. And a lot of that is due to wetlands. In Kinbasket, it's just a much harsher environment, larger drawdown, and hasn't got that vegetation growth that Arrow Lakes has, and Revelstoke Reach in particular. And you can see that in a number of species. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is you make a wetland or make some habitat, if Dave gets too busy down there, we're going to end up with a lot of birds, which may or may not be a good thing. And then within the reservoirs, you see a lot of variability. So as among, what these dots are habitat communities from both Revelstoke Reach, Arrow Lakes Reservoir, and Kinbasket. The Kinbasket ones are the habitat mapping that Virgil's group has done, which is very good. The red dots are our habitat maps. We're not botanists, we're birdie people, and so we just kind of classified it based on habitat from a bird perspective, how we saw it, much less botany oriented. But you can see that these, on here, of the mapping that's been done, the amount of the habitats that are common, these ones, we haven't seen much of a species richness in them. The habitats that are used by a lot of species tend to be uncommon. And when you look at nest density, it's even more striking. So if you want lots of nests, there's only a few habitats that are very uncommon that have a lot of these nests. Most of the reservoir drawdown zone is garbage for birds. So this is where my study comes in, and I'm going to introduce it. Do we want to encourage birds to nest in reservoir drawdown zone? And I should have introduced it earlier. CL Beam 36 is the study I've been working on since 2008, and it takes place in Revelstoke Reach, not the whole of Arrow Lakes Reservoir, not down here, although I am semi-familiar with the habitat down here, and also Kinbasket Reservoir, where we work in Canoe Reach, up by Valemount, and in Bush Arm, down by Golden. 10-year study, very similar to many of the studies Virgil's working on. Our focus, though, is very much to just focus on the bird communities, what's working, what's not, how bad the reservoir impacts the birds, and what can we do to improve it. So here's a picture of a yellow warbler nest. At this level is the water. That's why you can see a reflection of the branches. And there's the next day. And that's what I study, basically. That's what the point of the study is like, how bad is this? Is this bad? Or is it not bad? And how can we reduce it? And we were just talking about Shuswap Lake, which is naturally going up and down, and Arrow Lakes naturally went up and down. I don't know how bad it is naturally. I'd love to do it. If I could get paid to study natural nest flooding issues, it's got to happen. You look at what happens in the Fraser, the whole, through Hope down to the ocean every time it rains lots. It's lots of habitat, and the Shuswap system, lots of habitat gets flooded. But it definitely happens in the reservoir, and it's controlled by people. It's a regulated system. So Hydro wants to know about it, and that's what we've been studying. And it is sad for sure. I think about 30 species so far flooded. And for some species it's really bad, and some it's not so bad. So the basic study, Kinbasket, Arrow Lakes. This is an old slide from another presentation. One of the things that I did is make a model of once I got enough data. This was 2014 data, so we've got the years we were studying what the reservoir did, and we figured out nest density, the availability of habitat types, the nest density in those habitats, make a model, and then you can see how bad the impact is. Every time the reservoir crosses something with a more fiery color, it's flooding lots of nests. This is pretty useful. And this is Arrow Lakes. I'll get back to this later on. What I want to just point out right now is there's a bit of a box you can put around the nesting in time and space. Middle of the summer, from 4:30, maybe that box is a little generous, more like 4:37 up is where the birds are nesting. So that's our sort of hot zone in that time and space. And you can do things with this model like predict how bad the nest flooding was. So this is just a correlation of what we observed and what we modeled. And it's predictive, of course. But there's, if you think of that box, that was all species nesting, all 60 species in our lakes in that example. And it's going to vary for every bird because they don't all nest in the same spots and they all have a different exposure. So this is, so as at the species level, there's where they nest, when they nest, and we might be interested also in if they're a common bird or an endangered bird. And so we should look at it more, not just the whole community, but as individual species. So this is something we published a year ago or so, looking at 2 species that nest in shrubs. Now the shrubs is something that really interests me. It's not really a wetland thing, but it could be part of a wetland thing, because often there'll be shrubs and we create a wetland in a drawdown zone. And I was seeing all these shrubs in the drawdown zone and the birds nesting getting flooded, and the knee-jerk reaction is always, this is bad. And I certainly had that attitude, ecological trap, and I still do. But the old way of people that are worried about this is to go out and just say, yeah, this year we found X number of nests flooding, and this year we found, a few more or a few less, and report that. But it's not really legitimate because that's just one of many ways that a bird nest can fail. I could be going to check the nest and stand on it, and it failed. Or a predator comes along and eats them is the most common way. And if you were to read some of our reports and look at some of the basic stats, you'll say, oh yeah, predation's the big issue, the reservoir's not. Because we haven't really often presented it in the species-specific way. Every bird is different. If you're looking at savanna sparrows in the Arrow Lake Reservoir, it's quite common for them to get flooded. So in this paper, I really was keen on, do we want shrubs or not? Is it an ecological trap? If we plant shrubs in a drawdown zone and create nesting habitat, are we just luring birds in that are, have evolved in natural shrubby environments, and that's our habitat selection queue? There's food, there's nesting habitat, 2 thumbs up, let's commit to nesting here, and then boom, the reservoir comes up. Ecological trap. Or is it? So we compared 2 species here, the willow flycatcher and yellow warbler, and I think it was an animation thing here, yeah. And you can see the little box that you put around their time-space nesting is different. The willows are later and lower in the drawdown zone, and the yellows are higher and earlier. And here we can see the reservoir elevations observed during our study. So now these dots are when the nest gets initiated, and it takes about a month for the nest to finish. So start of June, and if you're here, you should be ended in July. No, you would have flooded. But if you're here, you're fine, because the water never came up that high. These guys, anyone above, well, that's 2012 right there, but anyone above that's pretty safe from flooding. Anyway, you can see the different exposure that these species have. And these are shrub nesting species that are fairly high in the drawdown zone, and they're off the ground. And every species will have its own box you could put around it. This is just a made-up image I made, and the full pool mark, and you can try and figure it out that way. I'll get back to the results on that one in a second. But in the shrubs, these are some of the birds that this is an old slide now. It's from the Regulated Rivers Conference. At that time, this was the list of flooded nests from these species we had observed. And you can see yellow warbler, we had quite a few of them. Willow flycatcher, quite a few. We have a lot more nests monitored for yellow warbler than we do willow flycatcher, but some of these were eastern kingfisher. These are less common birds in our region that were just highlighted in red there. And here's the results of what it did. So I don't think I enunciated this clearly early. When you just look at the causes of nest failure, it's not very good science, and the best way to do it is to calculate a daily survivorship rate, because what happens is you can't find that, you don't just see bird nests as they occur. They start, and eventually you find them, and what you find are the surviving ones. You don't find the ones that have already failed. and they get ditched from your study. So in order to avoid that bias, you've got to look at, well, what's the probability of surviving the next day to really quantify its performance, its nesting performance. So these are daily survivorship rates of birds. And, it's been a while now, I have to think. Here's yellow warbler in this picture. This is a juvenile. So this is the yellow warbler result. These are the birds that nested in habitat that never became flooded. These ones nested in habitat that did become flooded, and these nested on that floating island I showed you earlier. So these guys were doing really well. These guys, no difference. So the fact that they're nesting in a shrub like this did not make any difference to their survivorship despite nest flooding. And I don't have this second slide for the willow flycatchers, but the take-home message, that was the take-home message, was that it made absolutely no difference. And in willow flycatchers, if I remember correctly, it's 50% of all nest failures were due to nest flooding. But that made no difference. And the point was that when you nest in this environment, all your predators disappear. So normally you get all these predation hitting this, and not until we looked at it in this far more rigorous way that we could really disentangle it. And my only real point I think I want to make here is to sort of get me off the hook here, is to figure out whether shrubs are good or not is a tough question. And I can't really tell you that. But I can tell you there's a lot of nest flooding, and it's, do we want to create shrub habitat because these species have lost habitat or not? I still can't really tell you. But we have learned it's a lot more complicated than we initially thought. What's that? Puts what there? No, but we're talking about us putting them there. And also, we put the water there. Yeah, oh, that'd be great. Yeah, perfect, yep. Yeah. We've done a little bit, but we haven't got, you know what's, so that's actually an interesting point, is she's wondering if we have a controls above the drawdown zone, and we have a little bit, but what you have in the drawdown zone is entirely different from what you get above the drawdown zone. It's pretty hard to come up with a control.
I didn't mean the drawdown zone versus that. I mean in another area where there's just a natural lake that doesn't fluctuate.
Right.
So it's a similar environment.
Oh.
Like the lake level doesn't fluctuate like the ones that are controlled by the dams.
There's quite a few studies of nest survivorship in like yellow warblers, for example, all over the place. And these DSR values, these are fairly low, but they're not drastically low. They can be, some studies are quite a bit worse. This is high, but some around here is probably about normal. But you know, that literature review hasn't really been done. It's something that needs to be done, yeah. These are both in the drawdown zone. This would be probably in a dry year. So the water never got to the nest site. Exactly, yeah. No, I wouldn't say that. The study of ecological traps is basically that humans alter an environment, and a bird uses it because it has the habitat selection cues, but it doesn't perform the same way. The reservoir drawdown zone is a completely artificial environment, and we don't know. The water's just one thing. Food could disappear. Think if you're a bird that forages on the ground, what's going to happen to your food supply? So it's complicated. And then these shrubs have different growth pattern, and is it as good a nest cover or not? There's many ways. A ton. That's why I wanted to go to this real basic. Let's just look at nest survivorship, because you can't control for all these possible things. The food, like the minute water comes in, the foraging completely changes for these birds. And we recognize at the outset, and the predation levels, and it turns out the predation one was real. So. Yeah. That would be awesome. Yeah. Is it? Right, yeah, that would be ideal if we could create the studies like that to begin with, but that was not in the contract. So, maybe, yeah, and I think literature review is one way of getting at that. Like, we don't really need, when you see a drowned young, it is like, there's no question about it. You don't need a control to figure that out, but the overall nest survivorship, it's nice to have a good idea of what normal is. And I can just tell you that this is sort of normal, not great, but doable, and this is remarkably good. So I think we'll find a lot of study, like I did compare other willow yellow warbler nest survivorship studies, and these were at the lower range, which is a form of control. We're talking California and Manitoba. Daily survivorship rate. Just the probability, this is a 0.95 whatever, 0.957 chance of surviving the day, 24 hours. The day, so every day it has that chance. And there's a survivorship curve, only so many of them make it to the end. They roll the dice every day, weighted at 0.957. So, in wetlands, that was shrubs, right? I was talking about birds and shrubs. In wetlands, these birds, these ones are fairly uncommon in our region. And these are the number of nests at that stage that we'd seen flooding. Yellow-headed blackbird's a big one. It's the leading cause of nest failure for these species. Now, what was interesting about that last, with the shrub, I didn't know this, but the reason you get colonies of birds nesting in wetlands is because there's low predation rate. That's why the red-winged blackbirds all nest in one spot, defend these nesting territories, and then they go and forage somewhere else. So it's a really awesome nesting site. But when you get a reservoir coming along and flooding them, the airport marsh at Revelstoke Reach is just 2 meters below full pool, so that's a meter higher than the Burton one planned here. It's the leading cause of failure for these birds, and that's the only colony I know of between, from the whole of Arrow Lakes to Valemount. I mean, it's a fairly unique colony, and its leading cause of failure is nest flooding. I don't know what the net impact is, because you need recruitment, you need a far more detailed study to know, is it truly a sink or not? But it's certainly a healthy amount of caution, I think, needs to be thought about when we think about birds nesting in drawdown zones and the effect. So these guys get no benefit from the water. The birds in the shrubs lose the predators. These guys are already geared towards low predators, and all they get is nest flooding. So I think it can be mitigated. The airport marsh is at 438, 2 meters below full pool. And we've proposed that some sort of a barrier is created to protect it. Hydro wanted to know what's the best bang for our buck, what's the best thing we can do to mitigate the problems. Like shrubs, I can't really tell you. It's not actually that big of a deal as much as I thought. But the highest concentration of birds nesting in the whole of Arrow Lakes Reservoir, and the most diverse and most rare species are in the airport marsh. And so you'll save a lot of nests and a lot of really important nests if you can protect airport marsh from the reservoir flooding. So we've proposed that, and there's a project out right now to look at maybe the feasibility of that. But I think if we're creating wetlands in the drawdown zone, if we're going, well, we'll get to that in a bit actually. I'll get to that later. So that's what we found with wetlands. And then on the ground, we had a lot of nests get flooded. That's these ones. Some of them are, these are listed species. And stopping ground nesting is a real challenge as a flooded killdeer nest. Because they can nest quite low in a drawdown zone, for example, there's reed canary grass, it's really hard to know what we can do about that. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge, maybe unsolvable for reservoirs. So to summarize the nest flooding issues, vegetation increases nest density, and that usually increases at higher elevations. We don't know if it's good for productivity or an ecological trap. We're working on that, but nest flooding is certainly an issue. Good nesting habitat exists in some drawdown zones. Timing's important. And nest flooding, less of an issue in barren drawdown zones, possibly. If you've got Lake Sakakaway, or however it's pronounced, you've got the piping plovers, or Lake Diefenbaker in Saskatchewan, you've got endangered species nesting in a completely barren drawdown zone, and they get flooded. It's a major ecological trap for those birds. In other spots like Kinbasket, you've got very low nesting densities, and it's not a huge issue. Nest and wetlands are among the most impacted by flooding. So I just want to turn over now to non-nesting bird use in the drawdown zone. And yeah. No. You'd end up with a ton of new birds moving in. And if they did bring it up, it would be much worse then. But you're right. Yeah. Yep. And hold it steady. Then the birds would know, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it would be more like a run-up-the-river project then. So on another project I work on, we're looking at, it's more of the migration season. There's a little bit of reproductive work, but it's primarily looking at wetlands and birds that use wetlands. It's another 10-year study, and it's really multiple components. Look at shorebirds, waterfowl, ospreys, eagle, short-eared owls, harriers, and there's quite a few different component studies. Today I just want to focus on the waterfowl, and in particular dabbling ducks, because they're the most common waterfowl. And we've been working on this data recently. So this is each point is a survey that we've done, an entire survey, the total number of dabbling ducks on that occasion. So this is from Revelstoke down to 12 miles south of Revelstoke, Drummy Creek. We have a bunch of survey stations. We survey on occasion and add up all the dabbling ducks, and this is the picture we've got over time. This is a general additive model fitted to the data. It's a negative binomial, and 95% confidence interval of the standard count that you get at a certain time of year. It's a graph of seasonal abundance changing over time, and sometimes you get very high numbers, but mostly it's somewhere around here. That's what happens during the year. So getting back to the wetlands in Revelstoke Reach, LCOs, Loch Creek outflow. I haven't really talked about that. It's just a little muddy trickle that goes along just south of the airport. CB is Cartier Bay. MS is Montana Slough or Montana Bay, the floating wetland. And AM is Airport Marsh. And the important thing here is these two are really low. These are at 433 and change, so quite low in the drawdown zone. This one's 436, so 4 meters below the drawdown zone, quite a bit higher. And then Airport Marsh is 438, so it's really getting up near the top. And it's the one with all the emergent vegetation and the yellow-headed blackbirds and so forth. So with dabbling ducks, in spring, you can see Cartier Bay is by far the most well-used. This is the average, median count is somewhere just over 100 ducks when we go there during the spring survey. So that's at the height of the migration, averaged out with the tail end of the migration. At the height of migration, it would be quite a lot higher. So Cartier Bay is the number one. Even in the fall, it's also number one. So Cartier Bay is really important now. I think that the important thing is to remember this is really low in the drawdown zone. This is the one that's so fantastic to look at with all the nesting birds, all the emergent vegetation, the bulrush and the sedges and cattail. Not nearly as important for the migrating dabbling ducks. This is the floating bog, really not very important at all. And Loch Creek outflow, not so hot. Fall is kind of the same. Now this is the inundation. This is the amount of calculated water depth on every time we did a survey. And in the spring, no surprise, basically never inundated. These low ones occasionally were inundated by a small amount. In the fall, they're super inundated. So what is this doing to their use? You can see that Cartier Bay is a little lower, but what impact does it have? And you can see, obviously, the lowest ones are more often flooded, and this is at 436, and it's not flooded nearly as much in the fall, but it still gets flooded from. Airport Marsh pretty much never does. So Airport Marsh kind of fell off the end of the study for this one. Like, it's no use to us. The impact of water depth on our survey accounts is graphed here. And you could, so on the x-axis is the depth of inundation on the survey. Each dot is a survey, and you can see the models fitted to this. It's the same story at all wetlands. When you add water depth, you decrease your counts. So it's it really, when you flood the wetlands, they become useless for the migrating birds. And Cartier Bay, I mean, it's really obvious. When you go there, full pool, it's just a lake. You don't see any wetland anymore. It's just open water. So the key thing here is that some of these wetlands are highly suitable for waterfowl, even though they are really low in the drawdown zone. The reservoir does impact them, but when the reservoir is gone, these sites are functioning. They're doing an ecological service. So, final thing I want to talk about is restoration targets. Now, that's what I've been a quick overview of what I've been learning while doing this work. And now, for today's session, I just thought I would reflect on what we've learned and my point of view of where we should be heading if we want to take into account birds. So here's back to my model. You probably can't notice the change, but the red arrow points to it. It's the same image I showed you earlier. It's actually 2014. I calculate, I'm going to have a before-after here. Did these in different years, build these graphs. But it is essentially our model, and this is what it looks like without the airport marsh. And you add the airport marsh, and you add some red-hot nesting zone right in the wrong spot. I did that as part of our justification for protecting the airport marsh and what a difference that would make. I could calculate how many nests would get saved every year if it was protecting the reservoir operations. So reversing that logic, I thought for today, let's say that's how it looks right now. We want to make an airport marsh. Is that a good thing? I would say no. I don't think it's necessarily a good place to nest. The water shoots right through it, right in the heart of the nesting season. Notice that it's the only one getting to the more orangey color. It's better than, there's more nests at 438 because of the airport marsh. So that's one of my main take-home messages right there. When you're designing a study, from my perspective, I'd really like to see, or designing not a study, a project to create a wetland, I'd really like to see that the nesting is considered, since that's what my focus is. And so you've got to consider when birds are nesting. And, that's the easy part, really. I mean, you're talking May, June, July. Something like that. Ballpark. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then you've got to think about what reservoir you're on. We're on the Arrow Lakes here. This is Kinbasket. So you can sort of think, well, my wetland's going to be, 4 meters below full pool, like the airport on us, be more like Montana Slough. And they're nesting at this time of year. Is that going to be good or bad? Well, it's kind of the middle of the breeding season when it cuts through there on a typical year. So that's not great for the Arrow Lakes, but it's not bad in Kinbasket because it comes after the nesting season. So let's say we're going to do this one. Is that okay at the ALR or is it okay at Kinbasket? I would say no, not at the ALR, because right when the nests are about to mature, they get swamped on a typical year. Kinbasket is just fine. The reservoir comes up after. So what about down here? I would say that is bad in Kinbasket. And what about ALR? What's that? Exactly. So there's no nest mortality, so that's fine. Kinbasket, though, I didn't tick yes or no because it's 15 meters below full pool. And there's two things there. Well, actually, the main thing is I don't know how the vegetation is going to respond. If you're going to create a wetland there that's crappy nesting habitat, like a Cartier Bay, then fill your roots. Fine. It's going to be something that the ducks can use, but nothing's going to be nesting there. That's not already nesting. That's about as low as we've had a bird nesting, and it was. Anyone guess what our lowest flooded nest was in Kinbasket? Tough question. Mountain bluebird and a stump. 15 meters below, I think it was. But anyway, if you create a bunch of really lush emergent vegetation, I don't know if that's possible, but if you did, that would be a bad thing. But if you just created basically what's there, but just some submergent vegetation in a wetland, that would be fine, because the birds wouldn't nest there, but it would create habitat. And another scenario right there. Okay at ALR, I said, and the reason is because at 10 meters below full pool, that's going to be a pretty basic. For ALR, for that regime, you got this much of the year underwater, not much is going to grow there. So it's not going to make nesting habitat. Again, at Kimbasket, I don't know. It's got a much shorter period underwater. Maybe you can start to get some more interesting nesting habitat growing there. So as a restoration target, do we want this or do we want this? I would say we want this. Unless we can protect that from the reservoir operation. So getting back to my initial point about reservoirs around the world, we've got an awful lot of this crap, absolutely useless. I don't know what the potential is to turn bush arm at this, this low type of habitat into a semi-useful wetland. 0, yeah, but it was a nice picture. But there is probably an awful lot of potential low elevation habitat that you can monkey with. And in Arrow Lakes Reservoir, I'm thinking, reed canary grass zones, just like Cartier Bay as a target. Right now, was it again, an ecological desert? Yeah, the reed canary grass. I wouldn't want to see it turned into nesting habitat. I wouldn't want to see shrubs. I wouldn't want to see any of that stuff. But if you were to make another Cartier Bay, which is, right now it's useless, but if you make something that migrant waterfowl can use, and they've lost a lot of, in the migrant corridors, they've lost a lot of habitat throughout the world from regulated rivers. I think that's a positive thing, and you can potentially turn what's pretty useless habitat into something quite useful. Yeah. So floating islands is something. Physical works to protect high elevation. Any wetland where you're going to create nesting habitat, I think, should be protected. As a general rule of thumb, so that they don't get inundated, and that's a tall order, I know. Target low elevation habitat for wetlands where you're not going to create nesting habitat, where it's too low in the Arrow Lakes. And this is just a schematic of what comes to mind for me. Now, Alan was saying that, making a diverting water can be an issue because often the intake gets plugged. But this is my sort of schematic. A protected wetland like the airport marsh where you've bermed it up and is safe, or create something right at full pool. And that's your baby. You're going to try and make the most beautiful wetland you can, stuffed full of wildlife, breeding, dawn chorus, the whole 9 yards. Maybe at a lower elevation, we could make a floating island. I think pylons are a good way to go for anchoring system, and anything goes up and down like a dock on the coast. It's kind of tough. Like Virgil was talking about the small habitat plots earlier, and I think that's a fundamental problem with floating islands. The Montana Bay one is big enough to have, 6 or 7 pairs of song sparrows. That's a pretty cool natural one. And there's many other species there that are, there's probably 6 or 7 pairs of yellowthroats and 6 or 7 pairs of cedar waxwings and a whole bunch of snipe and everything else nesting there. It's quite a nice example. In the Columbia River, they made down in Oregon, I think it was, or maybe it was Washington, they had a floating C-span barge for a colony of Caspian terns. It's awesome. They're colonial. Boom, a whole colony of nesting birds going up and down with the water. I don't know what scale we can work at, but you could potentially, if you had a nice bench of reed canary grass, dig a big old hole there, put some pylons on, and before you even divert the water, build this thing, and then let the water flow, and it just goes up and down with the reservoir. If it's a sheltered enough spot, maybe I'm dreaming, I don't know, but it would be really cool. I've worked a lot with floating islands for loons in the Wat-Chan, and now also in the Kimbasket, and at some other lakes not too far from here. Well, for loons, it's just a nesting platform. That's simple, real easy solution, because they get flooded all the time, and we've pretty much solved the problem at Wat-Chan Lake. So, yeah, we get like at least 3 out of 4 use our platforms every year, and they never flood. And the main thing is the broods that come off them are old, because the nest gets flooded, then they build another one, it gets flooded, and they're a month behind or more when if they are successful. And you go around to the natural lakes and you see these big, huge juvenile loons, and you go to Watchan and these little tiny things just getting started. But now they're big. They're totally caught up with normal schedule.
And how do you encourage birds to come to you?
Loons love platforms. That was like existing conservation technique that hadn't yet been applied to a reservoir when you did that. And so it's
So you got them at Watchan right now?
yeah, 4 platforms. There's one right by the dam, at the main dam. And you can. There you go. So, but this is I think the easiest is like trying to make a Cartier Bay. Well, easy, easy for me to talk about anyway. Like a nice low, shallow pond, in the reed canary grass. If you have some sort of water source, it doesn't have to be diverted. It could be natural, but you need some water source. But to me, that would be a lot better than a wasteland we see now. And like Virgil was talking about, like you're not really monkeying with something that's working. You're starting with something that's garbage to begin with. And if it's low enough in the outer lakes, it's never going to grow nesting habitat, but it will be good for waterfowl. Maybe. I'm not sure what makes that. How you get enough invertebrates and probably the right type of submergent vegetation growing that has stuff for them to eat. And that's something I don't know about. And yeah, it's just a summary slide. But my last point here was I really like multi-stage projects. To start small, I think we learned with some of the re-veg that going big straight off is a recipe for maybe killing people's enthusiasm for trying to fix things. Start small, see what works, monitor, learn, modify, go back, and maybe you can make a huge wetland complex once you figure out how to do it. It's like, well, this one we did this and we got shorebirds using it, or I think tinkering. It's a reservoir and it's a weird, novel ecosystem of sorts. It's messed up. We got lots of blank habitat that's garbage, so we don't worry about wrecking it. And anyway, that was my main messages today, I think, was just to think about the birds. I think we have a knee-jerk reaction to create habitat where there once was and there's no longer, but I think we've got to be careful about it. Thanks. Are you talking about loons? Oh. Absolutely. No, but with loons there is actually some pre-existing data on that. They fight over them. And loons are one of the few species that are known to kill each other. They're extremely territorial, and that's been an issue. They like it so bad that they have damaged each other. And so that's good. We haven't, pardon me? Well, we haven't seen that. I think it's a pretty extreme result, but it's a published result. And we haven't seen any evidence of that. We've been putting them where there's already loons nesting, and we're just giving them this option instead of that option, and they're switching over, and it's working. It's not working. We have one at Montana Slough, in the pond that's there, but Montana Slough is already this massive nesting island. What happens there is part of it goes underwater, so then the loons nest, then the reservoir goes down, then they're like 50 meters from the water's edge, and one of my field assistants brought back the hatching eggs. Like, this has been abandoned, but it's still alive, and it hatched and then croaked. I was like, how the hell am I going to feed a loon? But so I didn't talk about that today, but there's all these other weird things that happen. Pied-billed grebes make floating nests. When the water goes up, they were undercover, and suddenly they're just floating around in space, and they actually move away, and they get predated instantly. So there's quite a few weird things that goes on, but with loons, the biggest issue, well, they have two issues. One is that they get the nest flooded or they get stranded when the water recedes. That's actually a more commonly heard of issue.
So they have to be like right next.
Yeah, they're designed for swimming with their feet, and their feet are like little outboard motors at the back of their body. They can't walk.
Oh, they can't walk.
No, yeah. Yep. Yeah, for 36, we're looking at the whole community, and we don't have any bias towards any type of species. We're just trying to measure what's there, where they're nesting, when they're nesting, what the issues are, just observing. And for 40, the wetland project, there is a focus on short-eared owls because they're listed. And so we had 4 nests this year, 2 got flooded. The other 2 were in secondary habitats, and then they got predated. Like, yeah. Right. Yeah, the whole sinks, traps, and all that, they're kind of different views on a somewhat similar process, I think, just focusing on different aspects of it. There's only been a few listed species we've had to deal with. Short-eared owl, Avocet's provincially listed, also flooded. And we aren't really specifically looking at those in detail, but I just did a analysis in short-eared owl where we showed that the reservoir is an ecological trap or a sink for these species. When they come in, they're toast pretty much on a given year. 80% of the time their nesting elevations will be flooded during the nesting season. But the reservoir operation predicts them nesting. When you have a year like this, they're going to nest next year. Last year was a dry year. We had them nesting this year. And that same, 2009 was a dry year. We had them nesting 2010 because the high water kills all the voles. And so you eliminate their habitat and they don't nest. But when you have a low year, you get a whole extra year for the vole cycle to build up. And then they will nest. And now with 11 data points, it's statistically significant. So we just finished writing that up. And so the recommendation is either make sure you flood up to, say, somewhere around 438 every year to kill all the voles. That's probably the easiest thing to do. Or if you're going to have low years, do them for many years in a row so they can actually nest and try and have some success. And there has been successful nests in the past, 2001. Or you can try and just always hold it low. But it seems like the most viable option from my limited understanding of what's possible is just a guidance thing. It's like if you're getting close to flooding out the grasslands, try and do it, because that will prevent them from nesting the next year. And I don't think we want them nesting there. That's about as close as we've got to making any recommendations for endangered species. Yep. Yeah, Virgil's done quite a bit of work on the herptiles, like amphibians and the toads, snakes, and turtles. That's been going on. Mammals?
With pond breeding amphibians, we don't see any negative effects on breeding, because by the time eggs are deposited, the reservoir is typically low. And as the reservoir comes up, the eggs hatch out, and so you can only do a 12-day window for hatching. And then you have free swimming water. And amphibian tadpoles have a tendency to follow the warm water, which is typically for eating edge of the wetland. So even as the reservoir is coming up, the amphibian tadpoles are swimming along with the edge of the water. Mammals? We haven't actually done a whole lot of work on mammals in Harrow Lakes. There was just some small mammal trapping up in the in Basel Reservoir.
There's
But I haven't seen a muskrat up there.
there's muskrat in Airport Marsh, and I found a nest in Montana Slough.
Oh, that's right, I found that one this year.
You found one too?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, cool.
But not in capacity.
Yeah, voles I think is a big one. Like that's a pretty interesting system that deserves. Yeah, I think that deserves some study for sure. And then there's things like there are some other like otters and things that have to deal with mink.
They just haven't been studied.
Short-eared owl. We also get long-eared owls nesting on the ground, and they also get flooded. You had a question?
I was just going to make a comment that the area around the confluence of the Wood Canoe and Flood
Yeah.
has an indigenous place name. It's nice to call it at the Groundhog Place.
Oh.
So for some reason there was a very concentrated population of groundhogs in what would have been sort of prairie areas,
Right.
you know, in that
Oh yeah.
confluence valley,
Cool.
just for small mammals.
Near a boat encampment.
An anecdote.
Yeah. David Thompson overwintered.
So you're saying, you're questioning the validity of building a nesting site, but can we look at it like, if it's not there, they're going to nest somewhere else, right?
And be productive.
And be productive. So what you're saying is, if I build it, they will come there to the detriment of
Yeah.
their regular place.
Yeah.
So
They're making the wrong decisions.
they're making the wrong
Yeah.
decisions. So it's not in addition to, like, I know some years will be
Yeah,
flooded,
yeah.
but say if, I don't know, 60% of the time they don't get flooded, then that would be,
Yeah, if 60% of the time. But that's, in the Arrow Lakes, it comes up pretty full most years. Like, I think it's probably 3/4 of the time it comes up somewhat close to full pool. And so,
so what you're saying is it's luring them away from where they should be nesting.
yeah, yeah.
It's not providing
Every-
something
yeah.
new that would encourage more to.
It's going to vary a bit by species. Like I said we had a Tennessee warbler this year. That's just not a species we normally nest around Revelstoke. But for some reason, and one theory is because of the Fort McMurray burns, they like maybe went up there and that's where they were going to nest, and they turned around and came back to Revelstoke. We also had white-throated sparrows nesting. Who knows why? Maybe those big fires early in the year were enough to like make them, where do I go? But normally they have young. The young are raised in this natal habitat in this location. They migrate, they come back, and they got to choose a spot. And it's not going to be exactly where they were, but it could be close, and sometimes it's quite far. But if you create this nice nesting habitat, you're going to be, all these naive young animals are going to be looking for a place to nest. And it could even be experienced birds that are, like short-eared owls are a really good example of that have no fidelity to their nesting areas. Short-eared owls just, voles naturally do this, populations, and they're just hunting around for where is like mushroom patches. Where is it going to be this year? Sort of thing. Oh, mushrooms are sometimes always in the same spot, but, you know, depends on the day though, right? And short-eared owls are like that. And other birds are quite specific, come back to their natal grounds. And but there is always the element of dispersal, and creating all this habitat could be sucking those birds over when they could have done way better with a marginal or semi-marginal habitat in a natural environment. You know what I mean? But as you can imagine, that's really hard to quantify. And so I'm just more cautionary notes than I'm not trying to pretend I have a hard number. I had a pretty good hard number on my nest survivorship, but the whole picture of like once that nest survived, those juveniles have to jump out of the nest and they go plop into the water. Who cares that their nest survived with less predation? We've also got a study on that. But then they've also got to go south and back and then reproduce before they're actually contributing. And it's just so much. It's beyond the scope of our study to get to that detail. So all we can do is observe what's going on at the breeding ground and then think about the bigger picture and question whether this is a good thing or not. As it turns out with the shrubs, I feel there was some positive news there. That was good. But with the wetlands, it's all negative. The wetlands were definitely a huge concentration of rare species, and the number one cause of nest failure is reservoir flooding it at 2 meters below, at 438. Less than 2 meters below the full pool, actually. So, it makes me question whether I'd want to recreate that marsh somewhere else, even though the airport marsh is amazing. Like, it's the jewel in my backyard for wildlife. The yellow-headed blackbird population has pretty much disappeared some years, and we've seen huge, like 2012 was terrible for them, and they pretty much disappeared. Same with marsh wrens. They kind of disappeared. I don't know why exactly in their case, but in the airport marsh, yeah. And they're coming back slowly. I'm not going to say it's entirely because of that. There's other changes we've noticed too, but. Yep.
I don't know if you're aware of Ray Allen's study, but where they've done modeling
Mm-hmm.
for airliners connected as a stationary.
Right, yep.
I'm sorry, it's fluid in feet as opposed to the meters that we're used to.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm putting you on the spot, but if, let's say, it was under 14 to 25 feet, and it's like that for 5 years mostly, and we're 27 years of flood,
Yep.
could we have a new equilibrium that the wetlands could be helped, and that point it would be okay?
Obviously,
It's a stable level, and then up at one.
yeah, I'd say in the airport marsh, I'm pretty sure that would be safe under that regime in most of the years, and then you have the one high year. That probably wouldn't be so bad. I would think that's fine. Yeah. But under the current regime, it's pretty rough in there. No. No, they come right back and do it again. And in things like savanna sparrows, we pretty much saw they keep coming back, and then their population just got smaller and smaller and smaller every year. And then we had some dry years, and it suddenly came back again. So it was kind of cool. It showed we didn't have a lot of immigration from outside, that the population was shrinking, but they're right back there, same spot and then they get flooded, and then they move up higher, and then they get flooded again, move, like they re-nest, and they'll move sites entirely, like set up a whole new territory, and they don't seem to learn at all. Yeah, good question though. Yeah, bird brains. Yeah, hardwired. Yeah.
Thank you, Harry.